Happy Monday, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are watching me from around the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's podcast teaching. And I am Krista Bontrager. I am a public theologian and Christian apologist. And this is the channel where I offer teaching about the Bible and theological commentary on social issues. As you probably know, last May, I had to pause most of the work on my podcast in order to focus on writing my doctoral dissertation. I'm very excited to tell you that the writing is now done, and I am transitioning into the defense phase of this journey. And God willing, I will graduate with a Doctor of Ministry in May. And I want to make sure that I'm being very accurate and fair in my credentialing. I am not getting a PhD. I know it's a little confusing. The world of academia has its own vocabulary and ways of thinking about things, but I'm getting what is called a D-Min, Doctor of Ministry degree, not a PhD. So a PhD would be a little bit more higher in the academic than what I'm doing. A Doctor of Ministry is what is called a ministry degree. It has a little bit more of a practical component to it. And so it is seen as still a terminal degree. In other words, I've come to the end of my educational journey. It's a nice little capstone with a bow on top. But I want to be very fair and accurate that I am not getting a PhD. I know that there's been some confusion about that sometimes when I talk to people, so I wanted to take a minute to clarify that issue. But don't worry, even though I'm getting this little fancy degree, I don't plan on changing anything about this channel. I don't plan on turning it into a super academic channel. My plan is to keep bringing you just very accessible theological teaching. I call it biblical teaching for the regular people. I had to do the academic thing in order to be a good steward of the ministry that God has given Monique and I to do. But at my age, I'm not doing the academic thing in order to show the world what a wonderful and smart person I am. I'm just trying to fill some holes in my education and my learning, so that I can lead God's people in better and more informed discussions about culture and what's happening and all of the issues that Christians are facing today. And that kind of brings me to the purpose of today's show. The theme on the podcast this year is Theology Mom's Advice. I'm going to be hitting a variety of topics related to this theme throughout the year. This is kind of in the spirit of older women teaching the younger women about the wisdom of Scripture, like it describes in Titus chapter 2, verses 3-5. And the advice that we are focusing on today is how to become a lifelong learner. Now, when I was a kid, and I would say something like, I can't do such and such, or I don't know how to do this thing, my mother would often respond to me by saying, but you can learn. And this is, I think, a really good summary of my heart for this channel. Maybe you don't know that much about church history or how to properly interpret the Bible, or you're not really sure how to decipher who on the internet is teaching sound biblical doctrine and who isn't. My hope is that this is a place where we can model a posture of it's okay not to know, but you can learn. And that's why I have asked my friend and mentor, Kenneth Richard Samples, to come back to the show and talk to us about some principles that he's developed over the decades related to lifelong learning. Now, you might recognize Ken. I think this is maybe the fourth time he's been on the show. He's one of my favorite guests. He is a person who has taught me so much of what I do in my teaching. I learned by watching Ken over the last 30 years of our friendship. And he has probably taught me more than anyone just the ethos of how to not only be a good theologian, but how to walk a road with people in the faith and invite them to come along on a journey with you. And that good doctrine matters, but also good praxis matters in how we treat people. And he is a wonderful example and influencer in my own life on the issue of lifelong learning. And I'm excited to share his wisdom with you today. And with that, I want to welcome my friend Ken Samples back to the Theology Bomb podcast. Welcome, Ken.
Hello, Krista. Congratulations on that new book and also creeping toward that doctoral degree. So congratulations.
Well, thank you. And you've been an encouragement to me over the years of, just waiting on the Lord and having all those years of raising my family and focusing on family first. And I was finally in a season after my kids were grown to be able to do that. And it's been quite a journey. So thank you. Well, for those who maybe haven't seen you before on the show and you're new to them, maybe give a brief introduction about yourself and your research interest.
Well, thank you. And thank you for those kind words, Krista. I'm creeping up on having been involved in the professional sphere of philosophy, theology, and apologetics. I think in a couple of years, it'll have been 40 years that I've been working in that field. I know you and I go back 30 years in our friendship, and you and I work together at Reasons to Believe, I think, for more than 20 years.
Yep.
So to go back to the late 1980s, I worked at the Christian Research Institute. I was a researcher who worked with and for Walter Martin, who was kind of the father of counter-cult apologetics, if you will. And he was a huge influence on my life. I worked there for 7 years. I then started my own organization called Augustine Fellowship Study Center, where I would teach and dialogue and debate and write. And then I met and became friends with our friend, Hugh Ross. And so for the last close to 28 years, I have worked as a member of the staff scholar team. I'm one of the few people there who is not a scientist. My background comes in philosophy and theology. So that's a little bit of a memory lane about my long work in apologetics.
And I do want to encourage people, and I'll put it in the description to our previous conversation, just talking about your career and some of the unique features of the people that you've worked with and some of your experiences. Now, I think that a lot of people, when I say the word learning, we think about learning in the context of school. And school doesn't really have any connection in our minds a lot of the time with faith or what we do at church. And one of the things I learned from you that was so influential in the early part of our friendship is your thoughts about the importance of Christians having a robust life of the mind. You were really the first person that ever came along in my life and said, hey, I'm not sure that book learning is a contradiction to spiritual things like prayer and going to church. I would love to start the conversation right there and have you talk about your approach to learning and how it fits with faith.
Yeah, I came across a great quote many years ago by someone who has influenced me, Yaroslav Pelikan. He was a professor of historical theology at Yale for many years, written wonderful books. The quotation I love by him is, "The church is always more than a school, but the church cannot be less than a school." And I think some of the big problems that we have in our church and in society come back to the idea that our churches are somehow less than schools. Now, I don't mean a K through 12 school that's connected to a church. I mean a vibrant learning place where people can come. And of course, the church is many things. It can be a hospital. It is a place where we take the Lord's Supper, practice the sacraments. and of course, a place of communion among Christians. But if I walked on the grounds of your church, would I get the impression that this is a flourishing place of learning? And how I tie it to scripture is this way, Krista. You know, I talk a lot about clear thinking, critical thinking, having a very logical approach to various issues. Well, I think when we come to scripture, that kind of clear, careful thinking brings us right into the word discernment. In the New Testament, the word discernment is very critical. Paul tells us to test all things. John says, don't believe things too quickly because there are many false prophets in the world. And what I see as discernment is part of this process of thinking carefully, consistently, cogently. And of course, I think there are many benefits to be had by that. We discover truth. We can become a wise person. And, not everybody has the same intellectual level. I'm not a Yaroslav Pelikan. I'm probably not a Walter Martin. But I want to use all of the skills and abilities the Lord has allowed me to attain for Him. And so I see this as loving God with your mind. You want to love Him with all of your attributes and skills, but loving with the mind is very, very critical, especially in a time where I think there's lots of propaganda, there are indoctrination. We're kind of, the society in which we live is filled with false ideas that need to be discerned and thought through.
Yeah, I think you're touching on a number of very important points there. Discernment ministries and discernment YouTube channels are really on the rise. And what those entities often end up being, I'm not saying that this is how it was when you were working with Walter Martin. I think times have changed, but anyone can get behind a mic now and have a YouTube channel and start saying, they're going to help other people discern, bad teaching from good teaching. And there are plenty of voices on the internet trying to do that today. But what I've appreciated over the years about your approach is that you're not just getting behind a microphone to say, here's the good people to listen to, and here's the evil people to listen to. Like, here's the heretics, or here's the Bible compromisers. Rather, you're taking an approach of, let's learn how to think properly.
Yeah.
Let's read some important books. We're going to talk a little bit about reading later in the conversation, but not all books need to be read the same way. Not all books are equally helpful, especially in the beginning of our learning. You also have taught me to learn the value of learning logic. And so maybe talk a little bit about how you see things like learning logic, which doesn't sound very spiritual, doesn't sound like prayer and reading my Bible, or reading books can actually strengthen my spiritual life.
Yes, if you look at the Hebrew Old Testament, if you look at the Greek New Testament, Krista, you discover that thinking carefully, pursuing truth, gaining wisdom, this is a very important biblical emphasis. You think about the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. It says that that wisdom is grounded in the fear of the Lord. That is, a person who can really become wise and become a morally virtuous person, it's going to be grounded in your devotion to God, in God's work in our life. And I think as well that this idea of thinking carefully, being a critical thinker, it does come out of Scripture. The Bible talks about intellectual virtues. Now, most Christians are more familiar with the moral virtues. Don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, honor your marriage vows, etc. Those are very important moral virtues, but the Bible talks about intellectual virtues like testing. Acts 11, where Paul is talking about the Hebrew Old Testament and the coming of the Messiah, Jesus. And the Bereans are opening their Hebrew Bible and fact checking, if you will. They're testing sources. So we begin to see that the Bereans are more noble because they're careful in their thinking, and they are very discerning by testing things. We're also taught in Romans 12 by the Apostle Paul. And I think today's world here in America is probably in many ways very similar to the ancient world of Rome. Lots of philosophy, lots of politics, lots of unusual ideas. So Paul says that we should not be taken by the world, but allow our intellect to be renewed. That's Romans 12. And of course, there is a lot of anti intellectualism. Unfortunately, even though Christianity has deep roots in wisdom and learning and education, and has influenced the really robust intellectual disciplines like education, science, and logic, there's still within our churches people who lean toward an anti intellectual world, who viewpoint, who think that, as you mentioned, there's a distinction between being a thinker and a feeler. Now, don't get me wrong. I love warm, caring, hospitable Christian people. I don't want to be part of a cold church, but I think you need to add to that the idea of intellectual virtues. So again, testing, fact checking, intellectual renewal. Those are so important for the everyday Christian, regardless if your IQ is on the level of Einstein, or you're just a solid person who is part of the church. You want to love God with all your assets, all your abilities.
Yeah. To love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, every part of us. And if God has given us a mind, that ought to also be part of our discipleship, a part of our growth in Him, and having those intellectual virtues of looking for evidence and thinking clearly, and even, as part of thinking clearly, understanding some basic principles of logic and informal fallacies. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while, but I know that a lot of my followers, they're new to issues related to apologetics, and they are following a lot of our friends and reading their books. My friends like Natasha Crane or Elisa Childers, or our friends at Stand to Reason. Greg Kokel had a book come out last year, and they want to read, but they feel overwhelmed by all the books. And so they might see the value of learning, but they're also trying to live in the real world of a lot of moms raising kids and doing dishes and having carpool things. And so I thought one of the things that was so helpful to me as a young person, and even when I was a young mom, is understanding that there are actually different kinds of reading. Yeah. We don't have to read all books with the same intensity. So maybe you can talk to us about some of the practical tips of, differentiating between skim reading versus inspectional reading.
Yeah, happy to do it. As a young person, I was not a robust reader. I wanted to be a professional athlete and didn't take my studies as seriously as I ought. But when I became serious about my faith in my late teens, early 20s, I realized that I needed to hit the books. And I'll tell you a book that transformed my intellectual life. It is so powerful that I reread it probably once a year. And that's How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler and Van Doren. This is a book that was written in 1940. It's been a bestseller ever since. It really explores the different types of reading, how to develop your reading. It changed my intellectual life. It is a great book. And Adler defines a great book as a book you can never exhaust. Think of the Bible. You never get to a point where you think, well, I've got the book of Romans down. I don't think I need to read that anymore. No, the Bible is the greatest of the great books. Adler, again, one of the great educators of the 20th century, a philosopher. I had the great pleasure of getting to meet him through email. And I told him, Dr. Adler, you changed the way I look at education and how I educated my children. And he said, "You've made my day." So that was a great opportunity. Well, Adler talks about four types of reading. First of all, one that we all are well aware of, it's called elementary reading or basic reading. You master that in elementary school. Even though reading and thinking is an incredibly complex idea, because human beings are exceptional creatures, a good reader at age 7 can really have a solid connection. So that's elementary reading. And sometimes we have to go back and review that, review grammar, review vocabulary. A second, and I think maybe the most important type of reading for many of us is called pre-reading or inspectional reading. Many people would call it skimming. Now, some people think, well, I don't want to skim a book. That's a superficial read. That's not the best thing. Well, inspectional reading by Adler is, in fact, reading. You would look at a book and read the introduction. You would read the chapter summaries. You would go through the index of the book. You would work through and look at the sources. And what you would be doing there, and you may even just sprint through reading the book. You're using a minimum amount of time to come up with a basic knowledge of the content of that book. Now, I think lots of people, Krista, and I've known many, and I'm in that camp as well. I have more books than I need, but not as many as I want. So I have more than 5,000 books.
Yeah.
But I used to have books pile up, and I'd read a quarter or a halfway, 3/4 through, and then I'd stop, and then I'd get another book. And then I'd have 12 books that were barely read. And I started feeling bad. But Adler taught me that skimming, inspectional reading, pre-reading is what you should do to decide whether you want to move on to a more involved type of reading. We call analytic reading, where you think through the book, you underline it, you move from page 1 to the end of the book. I think what would help a lot of your listeners if they learn to skim books. Now, I've got more than 5,000 books in my library. I can't take the time to read all of them analytically. But anytime I get a book, I immediately skim it and I note what is in that book just in case I want to come back to it. Or I may decide, this is such an important book. I need to analytically read it. I need to commit that time.
Yeah, I want to comment on that really quick, because that to me was just such gold advice that you gave me so many years ago. And people ask me, how do you read so many books? And I always have to explain, well, I don't read them all the same. There
Yeah.
are some books that I only skim read. And so I read enough of it to get the gist of it. In many books, they will give you the whole overview of the book in the introduction and chapter 1.
Yep.
They'll give you kind of the big picture of what that author wants to accomplish, what his big ideas are. And then I can decide, oh, is this book worthy of my time for a more analytical reading? And I had to read a lot of books for my dissertation. And many of them, I had only one day to read them. And so otherwise I would still be working on things. I had to read a virtual small library of books for my dissertation, but I could not read them all in the same way. So I could sit down with a book, look through the table of contents, and maybe even identify what were the most important chapters I think I need to read in this book. And maybe I only read 2 or 3 chapters in a closer, more analytical way, whereas the rest of the book, I'm just sort of skim reading it. I might even, you taught me, to maybe take some notes in the front so that when I come back to the book years later, I know, oh, these were the critical pages that I thought were important. And that helps lift the burden of I must read every page, every word of this book. Not all books are worth that. Um,
That's
and
right.
and talk about how might I know what's a book that I should spend more time on analytically? Like you said, I'm underlying, I'm maybe writing key ideas, summaries in the margins, and that sort of a thing.
Yes, very good. Well, one of the reasons to give a book an analytic read, as you realize that this isn't just a book about information or facts or data. This is a book that's really going to challenge me to think, to grow intellectually, uh, to become a more careful thinker. And those books tend to be heavier. They tend to be some of the great books. But again, Adler's book can kind of help you to work through this. So I'm very selective about what books I analytically read. And as I've gotten older, you knew me when I had black hair. Now I have a lot of gray hair. Well,
You and me both.
as I move forward, I have chosen to spend more time on some of these great books. Now, Adler has a fourth type of reading, and I know you can relate to it. He calls it syntopical reading, where you read multiple books on a particular topic and then draw your own personal analysis. That's kind of like a doctoral
That's
dissertation.
very much like a doctoral dissertation. Yeah.
So what Adler does is he takes you through these basic forms of reasoning, reading, and I think you need to be judicious because if you read every book analytically, you probably are going to get bogged down. And reading is one of the great joys and fulfillments in life. So don't be afraid to work with a book. And of course, sometimes I discover, hey, this is a good reference book. I may not need it
Yes.
now, but I know it's there. I know in my next book, I'm going to talk about the challenge of God not being present. And so I have a number of books I thought, well, I'm going to go back and review those sections. So being a smart reader, being a person who utilizes your time carefully, and I'll tell you, that book, How to Read a Book, Krista, really changed not just the way I read, but the way I think about various fields.
Yeah, I can relate to that. And when I purchase books, and I know that everybody's on Kindle now, and but for many many years, I felt like building my library was part of my Christian walk. And I wanted to have strategic books in my library that not only I could reference, but eventually that maybe my children could reference, and that they would ask me a question on a topic. And so I would kind of think in the future sometimes of like, hey, someday my kid might ask me a question about the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. Maybe I should read a book or two about that so that I'm prepared now before that topic shows up. And I want to build my library. Maybe I want to have two or three books in my library that if my teenager comes to me and we're having this conversation, I can refer a book to them. Or, like you said, reference books. There's a number of books in my library that I have not read, but I know they're there as reference books. So if I'm working on something, I can go look it up. Now, I know that you're a big believer in physical books over Kindle. I have had to change, I had to do most of my research for my dissertation on Kindle books because they were quickly searchable.
Yes.
And it made it much more efficient, and my eyes are declining and I can make the type really big. But when I was a young person and I had young eyes, I was really building my library and interacting with the books. And so those are some things that I've learned over the years.
I mean, again, when I was younger, I thought, well, education's what you do when you're young, and then you want to get a job, so you get a college degree, and that's how you make your way through life. I have now come to the conclusion that the most important learning is lifelong learning. Adler says most things that we learn of importance come after the age of 35 upon our own reading. So lifelong learning, it can also shield you from terrible things like Alzheimer's. It's not a slam dunk, but people who are intellectually active, they tend to be in a good position mentally.
I know that a lot of young moms who are listening right now, they're like, "Oh, I just don't have time to sit there and read a lot of books." Well, another wonderful piece of technology is Audible books.
Yes.
That's how my ministry partner Monique reads a lot of books as she does audiobooks. And then if she feels like the book is really important, then she'll buy the physical copy to add to our library. And sometimes she'll go back with the Audible and re-listen to it. Listening to it audibly for her helps her mind stay focused. And then she can take notes in the physical book. But she is able to consume a lot of reading doing Audible books. That has become a big part of her routine while she's commuting and doing other things, housework around her house. You know, she can listen to the Audible books. So if young moms are out there and you're thinking like, when am I going to read all these books? You can always think about Audible books while you're folding your laundry, doing your dishes, vacuuming your house. There are other ways to do it. So I do want to put that out there as well.
I have an hour commute to work. I'm listening to books all the time and
Yeah.
very meaningful, very
Yeah.
helpful.
So when you're thinking about whether or not you're going to spend your hard earned money to invest in buying a book, what are some of the things that you think about or steps that you go through when you're just kind of looking through the book? Am I going to give this person 20 or 40 of my hard earned dollars?
No, very important question. Well, I one question I'll almost always have is this a resource work? Is this a book that it may not benefit me now, but it may benefit me in the years to come? Is this a resource that I really need when I'm getting prepared for a talk or when I'm writing a book? So is it a resource work? Is this a book that's critical in my particular area of philosophy or theology apologetics? If it's a book that all thoughtful philosophers are expected to have read, then I'm likely going to pull the trigger and buy that book. But I'm also thinking about lifelong learning. And I think about my family. I've spent many years going to thrift stores and I found all kinds of remarkable books for pennies on the dollar. You can still do that. You can expose yourself to various bookstores. And Krista, I also ask, is this a book that I'm going to enjoy? Is it a book that's really going to stimulate me and motivate me? So I think about various uh, ideas or things in my mind, and I'm conscious of the money. And one of the reasons why I think ebooks are popular is not only are they're readable, uh, but also because they're inexpensive. So there are lots of things you can do to expand your library. And books are expensive, unfortunately. But if you're careful, you can build a really good library at a viable financial cost.
And I think for, a lot of the moms who might be listening, they might ask different questions about what books to invest in, where you're concerned about like, hey, I want to keep up with philosophy, and they might be thinking of a different criteria of
Yes,
I need to know about a particular issue because my kid is really interested in this issue. How
absolutely.
am I going to help them begin to integrate their faith? Maybe you have a kid that's really into art. Well, it might be good to spend and or invest some time and some money into reading some books related to a Christian worldview and integrating art into that. And how do those things fit together so that you can talk to your kid about that? Or maybe your child is really into music or um, I don't know. I had a child who had she's 25 and she's still sort of in the phase of really enjoying dinosaurs. And she sort of never outgrew it. But I think that the fun was when she was young and growing up was investing in books that she could read on that topic, even ones that were a little harder for her, to help raise that bar. And one of her favorite things to do when she was in elementary school is she would take her dinosaur encyclopedia with her when we had to go places and copy some of the things out of it into a little notebook. And so when you're providing a gift to your children through books as well, and helping to pique their interest, but also talking about how does our worldview fit into this. And so you as the parent might need to lead the way on getting some information and doing some reading, and then that trickles down into your conversations with your kids. So I think those are some of the things I also look for, Ken. And you know who taught me this was Gretchen Passantino. She had a wonderful little talk that she used to do about how to decide whether to invest in a book. And one of the things that I'll never forget this, she says, first I start by looking at the endorsers. Who's endorsed this book? And that gives me a window into what group of friends the author is in. And it might give me insight into, are they more progressive leaning, or are they more biblically oriented, or are they Presbyterian? You know, it gives some context sometimes to the author. Looking at the table of contents, looking at what is this book really about, and what are the big ideas, reading the back cover, reading the book description on Amazon, or what does the book description on the back cover have to say. That gives me a 30,000-foot overview of the book to see if it's really going to meet my needs. So, you know, there's just some additional things to think about.
Yeah, and think of how much you can learn about a book by skimming it for a half an hour. You can learn a lot. Books give clues. It's important to be able to learn as much as you can, and again, you're building a library, and that's, in my mind, one of the most important things in my life.
Yeah, and sometimes I buy a book and then, you know, like a half hour or maybe a couple hours later, um, Bob will say, "Are you done with it already?" And I say, "Well, I get kind of the gist of it. I get the gist of his argument." And you know, but that's a skill. It takes time to learn and practice. But I have found that kind of skim reading to be very important. Now I know you have a new book called Clear Thinking, and I'm going to have Bob put it on the screen so everyone can see it. Tell us a little bit about the book and what prompted you to write it.
When I was teaching in college, and I taught my first logic class in 1990, so that's 35 years ago. Krista, what I discovered is, of all the classes that I taught, world religions, introduction to philosophy, ethics, the class that students would come back to me time after time was introduction to logic. And they would say things that excited me. They would say, "Professor Samples, I now have a skill. I can I know what an argument is. I can take it apart and put it back together. I know how arguments break down into fallacies." And they said, "I've never had a class before that that I think has transformed me." And so I've been teaching logic for 35 years. There are very few things in life that are as important as how you think. And I wrote this book with my colleague, Mark Perez, who is an administrator at RTB and a philosopher of science. But this book is, again, entitled Clear Thinking in a Messy World, A Christian Guide to Logic, Reason, and Cognitive Bias. So there are great sections on the laws of logic, sections on informal fallacies. I give you advice. I give you suggestions how to work through these things. And early on, we have quite a robust chapter on the importance of the life of the mind, loving God with all that you are. And Mark does a wonderful job of presenting cognitive biases. I don't know any other logic book that has a section on cognitive biases. And I think there's some unique features. So I'm very excited about the book, something I wanted to do for a long time. And you were part of that process because you said that's a good book. RTB needs to publish it. So
I kept trying to advocate for it.
I
And
appreciate you very much. Yes.
I felt like this is a book that needs to exist. And I don't feel that way too often about a lot of books, but this was one I felt like was very important. And I do want to encourage people, if you're looking for just an introduction to logic that's in everyday language, this is a really good option for you. And then if you're a homeschool mom and doing the homeschool co-op thing, this would be a wonderful way of equipping yourself and then being able to teach your kids and lead them through some of those other curriculum and programs. But this will help you get on the on ramp. And I also want to give a shout out to my friend, Kathy Gibbons, who has an amazing podcast called Filter It Through a Brain Cell, where she goes through a lot of informal fallacies for middle schoolers and high schoolers. But it's a wonderful podcast where she's really trying to educate people, but moms love it too. And, if you're wondering, like, how can I think better? What are the rules for better thinking? Learning logic is a wonderful first step. Ken, share some additional thoughts about what benefit you think there is for a Christian to learn some basic principles of logic and things like informal fallacies.
I think that, logic is all about examining arguments, not a spat or a fight, but examining a way a person makes a claim, supports the claim, and then leads you inferentially from the support to the conclusion. Call that an inference. Well, the study of logic can help you discern between good arguments and bad arguments. It can teach you as well how typically arguments break down and the reasons they break down. And this puts you in a very good position as you're reading books, you're discerning, you're thinking through the argument with them. I think that this is very powerful. And of course, remember, we live in a society very different than the world I lived in. When I was growing up and I wanted to get information, I had to go to the library. My son, on the other hand, is born during the internet age. He most of his reading is online, but he has a challenge. Can I trust this material? Is this a good source? And so I think that logic, I think that informal reasoning can be very, very meaningful. And it's a safeguard. It's a safeguard. You're guarding your deepest beliefs by having real vigor in ways of thinking. And so I think informal fallacies are a very important part of logic.
When my older daughter went to college, one of the things I told her is the course I really wanted her to take was a logic class. And her professor stood up on the first day and said, this is a class to help make you, to kind of bulletproof you against cults and indoctrination and propaganda, and she really learned that she can take apart an argument, a political argument, listening to a political speech, watching a political ad. She can differentiate between claims and support and evidence and fallacies. And so I think personally that learning logic is one of the most under taught skills. Ken was my Bob and my logic teacher, 25, 30 years ago. And I wish more churches would have classes in logic. And that's where we actually took your class, was that there was a local church who had like a Wednesday night kind of a thing. And you came and taught logic and informal fallacies. We need more of that.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about the church should never be less than a school, these are some of the things that we have in mind of basic classes in what does it mean to be a Christian, theology, church history, logic. I think these could be wonderful adjuncts to the culture of a local church. But learning how to think properly. And this was many people who listen to this podcast are familiar with my story of my friendship with Monique. And before we started the ministry, and she was fairly progressive in a lot of her viewpoints, but she was coming at the world through sociology and the social sciences, and she had no formal training in logic or fallacies. So when we first started our conversations about the world
Yeah.
and justice and injustice and race and racism and all of these topics, the greatest tool for me was the class I took from Ken Samples 30 years ago in basic logic and informal fallacies, because I could talk to her and say, well, that's a claim. You're making a claim. What is your evidence for this claim? How do you unfold this? Or I could say things like, well, that's an assumption that must be proven.
Yes.
And these are things that I learned from Ken. And these are the things that the Lord used in Monique's life to begin to drive a wedge in her beliefs about critical race theory. And so this is very practical, real world
Yeah.
benefit. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Ken.
Yeah, I think, one of the reasons we wrote our book, Clear Thinking in a Messy World, is I want it to be a book that Christians can return to. You can read it virtually in any order. But, maybe you say, hey, I want to know more about the laws of logic. What are these laws? Where did they come from? Or I want a tour through the informal fallacies. Or I want to be able to, as you mentioned, your daughter, take an argument apart. What is a claim? What is the support? How do they break down? Uh, so this is a book that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and I think it's a book that would be helpful to all Christians. And again, you can come back to it. Aristotle called logic ordered thought. Not that we don't think, and I'll bet virtually everybody who listens to your show knows how to think, but sometimes we're lazy. Sometimes we're not careful. And, we get diverted. So a book like this can be very helpful as you continue to work your way through the life of the mind to the glory of God.
Yeah. All right. One final topic. You have an article on the Reasons to Believe website. Now, I think this used to be called the 10 Academic Commandments, but when I checked on it the other day, you got 100 academic commandments now. So tell us, what are the academic commandments? And maybe you could share a few highlights from that list.
Yeah, this is a very practical article that I wrote. Part of it is for students in K through 12, where I talk about how to propel yourself in the classroom, the goals you should be seeking. I also talk about college students and how to navigate through various issues. I focus on some theology and philosophy and apologetic issues, but I also talk about lifelong learning. And part of this went into our book, Clear Thinking in a Messy World. That is where I talk about how to help your family to grow intellectually, like taking intellectual field trips. My kids have never forgotten the field trips we took. We went to Washington, D.C., and we went to Ford's Theater where Lincoln was assassinated. We went to various places, the World War II Memorial. My kids, now they're in their 30s, they still talk about these things. Remember when we did this and we did that? So I have all kinds of ideas that can help homeschooling moms, Also books that can help you as a college student, and again, encouraging you to recognize that the life of the mind is a lifelong process. And it's not to become a snob. It's not to think that you're smarter than others. It's the life of the mind to the glory of God. I want to use all of my skills for his glory. And those skills might be contending for the faith, defending the faith, teaching the faith. And I think there's a lot of practical advice, and it's free. It's right on the RTB website.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm just kind of looking through so much of it right now. And I think that one of the things that has really stuck with me from this list is preparation. Like when you're a student, come prepared, attend your class, be on time, and make an effort to make up classwork when you miss it. I think these are just very basic steps, but what I've noticed in conversations with the young people in my life is that a lot of times what seems basic to us as adults, like you need an adult in your life to sit you down and kind of go through these things of this is how to be a good student. I know one thing that our kids struggled with in high school was what to do if you're struggling in a class. And I love it that you even have advice about that. If you're struggling, discuss it with the teacher, consider seeing a tutor. Sometimes our kids can feel like, oh, I'm struggling. That must mean I'm dumb. And
Yeah.
that's not the case. We all have had struggles. I couldn't survive my Hebrew class in seminary. I had to hire a tutor. I was drowning. I mean, sometimes we just have to recognize that we can do some things really well and other places we need help, and that's okay. For the lifelong learner, I think that what's important is don't focus all your attention on the grade. Like, I'm going to learn to get a grade. I want to begin to have a mindset of learning is a virtue because I am growing my mind for the glory of God, not for the grade.
It's liberating. These practices are liberating because as you mentioned, all of us struggle in various ways. How do I work my way out of that? And what's become popular too is book clubs. I love it when a group of people read my book and then I get to meet with them on Zoom and talk with them. Well, why did you approach this, or why didn't you do that? This is a great opportunity, and we need preparation. Get to know your professors, introduce yourself to them,
Yes.
ask advice. And I love it, that last comment you made, that learning is an intrinsic good in and of itself, apart from grades or anything else. Learning is it gives glory to God because he gave us these remarkable minds.
Yes, definitely. And you had such a hand in teaching me that. And I think what you're hitting on there of book clubs, that's another great tip of learning community. Get with some other people. Don't feel like you have to do it all alone. Like, but one of the great things that Bob and I do is we go work out, go to the gym together, and we can encourage each other. Going to the gym by yourself isn't fun. So
Right.
find some friends that have like-minded that you can be in community with and read together. So thank you so much for doing this, Ken. It's been wonderful.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much. Once again, I want to encourage you to check out, see if you want to purchase Ken's book, Clear Thinking in a Messy World by Kenneth Samples and our friend Mark Perez, who has been a former guest on our podcast, All the Things, a former law enforcement officer and also a philosopher of science. And this is a great way. If you want to start getting into logic, this is a great overview from a Christian perspective. If you'd like some more practical steps about how to grow in the faith, I want to encourage you to go to my website, theologymom.com, sign up for my monthly newsletter. When you do that, you will receive a free ebook called Discipling Yourself as you disciple your children. It's written forth with parents in mind, of just some 6 kind of baby steps to becoming a lifelong learner. I really spell it out very specifically. Here's what you can do. So if you kind of like the idea behind what Ken and I are talking about today, but you don't really know what to do next, go sign up for my newsletter at theologymom.com. You're going to get a free ebook called Discipling Yourself as You Disciple Your Children. It only takes 5 seconds to sign up, and you'll be able to download the ebook right away. You'll get an email in your inbox with a link so you can get it. And you'll also receive my monthly newsletter. It's just 1 email a month. I'm not going to spam you. Just 1 email a month. That's 12 emails for the whole year, where I summarize all of my content that I've released that month, as well as information about where I will be speaking. This is an awesome way for us to stay connected, just in case I ever get thrown off social media. You and I can stay connected. So go sign up for that newsletter. One final word as we close out. I just want to encourage you today that learning is a process. It takes time. Do not think that you need to learn everything all at once. Be patient with yourself. This is a journey, and trust me, you are going to, if you just start reading a little bit every day, find a friend or 2 that you can read in community with. Maybe think about, if you are a person who's a little further down the journey of these issues, maybe think about how you could start a little class at your local church to encourage others and bring some more people along in the journey. But trust me, if you start just listening to books, there's even some books that are on YouTube for free that you could listen to, but just start the process. When you look back 1 or 2 years from now, you will be amazed at how much you have learned. It will feel hard in the beginning because there's a lot, maybe new vocabulary, words you haven't heard before. Just be patient. Repetition is your friend. Time is also your friend. And you will amaze yourself with how much you've learned. And you know what will also happen is God will start opening up new conversations with new people as you read, because you've taken the steps to prepare yourself. He's going to bring new people into your life or new conversations into your life that you can now step into and begin to dialogue about, because you have taken some steps of faith to educate yourself more. I hope that you have found this podcast helpful and encouraging. I look forward to your feedback. Make sure to leave a comment, either on YouTube or on Facebook about it. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good week. God bless.